Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. A first-of-its-kind collection of documents, historical records, and first-person remembrances aims to put the history of Indigenous slavery into context. The Native Bound Unbound Digital Archive just launched, providing a searchable database available to the public. It concentrates on instances of slavery throughout the Americas to bring stories of enslaved Indigenous people into a new light. We'll hear from the organizers of the project right after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. President Trump wants the Defense Department to resume nuclear weapons testing immediately. As KJZZ's Gabriel Pietrorazio reports, that's sending shockwaves around the West.
Prior to a moratorium imposed by Congress in 1992, the U.S. conducted over 1,000 nuclear tests, mostly done at the Nevada test site, even hundreds of above-ground detonations.
We can't fully rule it out. That would be extremely provocative.
Daryl Kimball is executive director of the Nonpartisan Arms Control Association.
I don't think people need to fear mushroom clouds on the desert floor outside of Las Vegas, but the very notion of resuming nuclear testing, in my view, is a disrespectful slap in the face to those who in the past have suffered from radiation poisoning from nuclear testing fallouts in the Mountain West.
Like Leslie Begay, a former Navajo uranium miner. He's also a Vietnam vet and cancer survivor, having a double lung transplant with 123 stitches in all.
That was the hardest thing I ever encountered. These are some of the things that people are going to go through.
Compensation for radiation exposure victims was revived this summer. For National Native News, I'm Gabriel Pietrorazio.
Residents of St. Lawrence Island in the Bering Sea have traditionally subsisted on walrus, whales, and fish, but availability of marine resources has been changing, and reindeer have become a staple. Now, Savunga is almost done building a meat processing facility that can turn it into a business. Ayolna Naiden with the Alaska Desk has more.
Richmond Tooley rides his four-wheeler across the wet tundra outside of Savunga. The mountains of black volcanic rock glisten behind him in the September sun, and the Bering Sea in front. Tooley is a third-generation chief reindeer herder. He pauses to spot the animals through his binoculars.
All summer there are reindeer out here.
St. Lawrence Island sits 100 miles west from mainland Alaska, with two villages on it, Savunga and Gamble. It's also home to several thousand free-range reindeer. In the late 1800s, famine struck the island, and the animals were introduced here as a food source. Today, the herd continues to support the island as warming conditions disrupt subsistence, and storms can hold up food deliveries for weeks. Now, Savunga is building a reindeer meat processing facility. Freeman Kinnicook is the business director of the Savunga Reindeer Commercial Company, a subsidiary of the village that will manage the facility. He says the plan is to slaughter reindeer about 4 times a year and sell it locally. In the future, there might be a chance to distribute it to other Alaska villages as well.
When we did those trial runs, we would sell on Facebook, and we couldn't keep up with the demand. It's undecided who the market is, but I know there's a market for it.
Perry Idiganak Pangowi is a subsistence hunter and one of the locals working on a project. Pangowi says the new facility already brought a much-needed influx of jobs to the village and might open new economic opportunities.
It would be nice to have our stores selling our local reindeer, because it's hard to afford that steak. It's like $50, $60 for a piece of steak. And to me, reindeer tastes a lot better than steak.
Construction is scheduled to be completed in the coming weeks. With reporting from Savunga, I am Alona Naiden.
And I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced by Kawanak Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Skugtash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods, tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Tom Yang. Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Strauss, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. Not long after Columbus's arrival in the Americas, indigenous people were enslaved by Europeans set on colonization. A new digital archive, just launched online, tells the story of an indigenous teenager from the Caribbean who attempted to escape slavery by stowing away on a ship sailing for Spain in the early 1500s. He was discovered, imprisoned, and enslaved. Despite repeated petitions for his freedom in Spanish courts, he lived out the rest of his life enslaved by a Spanish locksmith. That is among accounts now available online in the newly launched Native Bound Unbound website. It's a digital collection that aims to document every instance of indigenous slavery in the Western Hemisphere. It includes interactive maps, digitized documents, interviews with descendants, and more. Today we'll talk with the lead on the project and Native historians about the story of indigenous slavery. We also want to hear from you today, our listeners. Please join our conversation with a comment or question. Just call 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now in our Albuquerque, New Mexico studio is Dr. Estevan Rael Galvez. He is the Executive Director of Native Bound Unbound, Archive of Indigenous Slavery. Estevan, hello, and welcome to Native America Calling.
John, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you today.
Joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts is Dr. Philip Deloria. He is a professor of history at Harvard University. He is Yankton, Dakota. Philip, hello. Welcome back to Native America Calling.
Thanks so much for having me.
And joining us from Acoma Pueblo, New Mexico is Teresa Pascual. She is the Executive Vice President of Indigenous Affairs at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and the former Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pueblo of Acoma. She is, of course, Acoma Pueblo. Teresa, hello. Pleasure to have you on the show as well. Welcome to Native America Calling.
Good morning. It's wonderful to be here.
I'm excited to have all of you on this show today. And Estevan, I want to begin with you. What started you on this project to document indigenous slavery?
Sean, this started out as a personal story. I was 8 years old when I watched Alex Haley's Roots, a syndicated TV memoir of his family's life, the generational legacy of slavery. I was 8 years old in northern New Mexico watching that, but also listening to stories that were being told of my own ancestors who were enslaved. A Pawnee woman that my great-grandmother told about, who was her ancestor. She passed that story down to me. And another story that was folded into my hands in the form of a blanket when I went off to college. My mom gave it to me and said, for knowledge, strength, and protection. It had been woven, as the story went, by a Dene ancestor of hers who had been captured as a young child and taken into the village of Abiquiu, and she became the matriarch of the Rael family. It would start me out on a professional pathway to actually recover the story of individuals like that and to try and understand the legacy. I descend from 12 individuals who were captured and enslaved.
Okay. Esteban, you and I are right about the same age because I think I was either 8 or 9 when the Roots miniseries premiered. It was a big, big event. But let's keep the focus now here on this indigenous slavery issue. What is your viewpoint of how the general public understands slavery, again, as it pertains to indigenous people?
Most people don't know about it, Sean. Certainly in the United States, I think when people use the word slavery, they immediately think of Africans who were brought across the Atlantic Ocean. But so our goal is to actually illuminate where slavery took place, when it occurred, whom it impacted, and its meaning, particularly its legacy for both indigenous and descendants. But I think for the most part, even though there's years and decades of scholarship, I think in the United States in particular, people don't know about this story other than those who have heard the story in their own families.
Esteban, you were New Mexico state historian. You were also the executive director of the National Hispanic Cultural Center. Did you encounter clues in those positions that informed this project?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I went into those positions, Sean, having finished my doctoral dissertation focusing on enslavement throughout New Mexico and Colorado, really throughout the Southwest. And people knew that I had done that. They knew that I had created a database to actually document this. I had already spent years looking through records, sacramental records, wills, probate records. And so people came to me often looking for an ancestor in the database that I created that just sat on my computer. And I wanted to actually make it much more broad. But certainly throughout those two positions and the arc of my entire career, I kept pulling the strand of this story and engaging with communities who were interested in hearing about it.
The nativeboundunbound.org website, it is fascinating. The stories in this archive, they span centuries, and you have researchers from different parts of the world. I've never seen anything like this in my life, Esteban. I mean, I didn't even know this type of information existed. What are these researchers up against in terms of finding all of these records, some of them dating back hundreds of years?
Oh, yes. We have people working from Argentina to Quebec, from California to Cuba. We have researchers in Europe. What they're up against is a mountain of material. And so there are so many documents in the archive, and what is available now that has gone through that process of digitizing, transcribing, translating, and coding represents maybe at about 3% what is possible. So we are working to identify those records and take them through that entire process. But there is so much material. I don't want to say overwhelming, because we're not overwhelmed. We're actually fired up to actually gather this material. And so but for us, it's also about respecting each and every individual and treating those documents that name those individuals with tremendous respect, to incorporate them, place them through that process, trying to understand what meaning they have, and then, as we can, connect them to one another.
3% is potentially what has been uncovered with this project. About how many research hours have gone into just getting that first 3% squared away?
Oh my gosh. We've been at it since 2022. So, it's actually a really good question, and we should calculate this. Thousands of hours, I can imagine. I know Dr. Michael Francis in Florida has just spent hours in Seville identifying records. Katian Dupuy up in Montreal has actually hours just to take one single document and try and read through it. And then the transcribers delicately pulling those records apart. I mean, one of the other things that they're up against is records that are hard to decipher, right? Records that are bound up, and it feels like if you're going to breathe on these records, they're going to fall apart. It's not entirely true, but they are treating them with some delicacy. then transcribing them. And so the rigor that has been brought into this is also reflected in those hours. Dr. Aaron Taylor, who's leading the effort in terms of the transcription, translation, unimaginable. I know he spends at least 5 hours a day at the very least, and he has a full-time job doing this.
Now, of course, contributors to the project also include people with actual familial ties to enslaved people and also enslavers. Tell me more about how they are able to contribute to the archive.
I estimate that we have at least 100 people working on this project, some who are engaged as contractors, some who are volunteers. I estimate that at least a third of those individuals, Sean, are connected at some level, either as descendants of primarily enslaved, but also enslavers, trying to understand what that means. And so it's a really important element for me. When the president of the Mellon Foundation asked me, who are you doing this for? You know, this project will be available for the general public, for scholars. It will advance scholarship tremendously. Educators who will deepen our curriculum, particularly at this political moment. I want artists to be able to draw from it. But the answer to that question that had been asked is, my North Star, the fire in my belly, is to actually make this available for descendant communities, both Indigenous and others who for whom their ancestors were severed from their tribal Indigenous roots.
The website, nativeboundunbound.org, is a digital archive. It includes images of artwork. It includes databases of people who were enslaved and also people who were enslavers. There are photographs, there are stories, there is just so much information, so much history here documented like never before. And today we are talking with people on the show who are a big part of this research project. Stay with us. We're going to take a short break, and we will be back. And we have a lot more to talk about on the show today. We have other guests on the show, and the phone lines are open for anyone who would like to join this conversation, talking about slavery in the Americas from an Indigenous perspective today. The number to call, 1-800-996-2848. That number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. The Australian state of Victoria just signed that country's first treaty with Aboriginal peoples. Supporters say it provides a foundation to adequately recognize the history, culture, and value of Aboriginal people and their local knowledge. We'll find out how this historic milestone came about and what it means going forward. That's on the next Native America Calling.
The Association on American Indian Affairs invites all to Tribal Museums Day, December 6th through December 12th. Tribal museums may offer no-cost or reduced admission, gift shop discounts, art markets, and live cultural demonstrations. Tribal Museums Day honors diverse Native nations as the experts of their own cultures. You can find a map of tribal museums and more at indian-affairs.org/Tribal Museums Day. The association supports this show.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We are discussing a new online archive called Native Bound Unbound that uncovers records of Indigenous slaves in the Americas. Let's hear a part of a conversation that is available on the archive. In a collaboration with StoryCorps, Native Bound Unbound features interviews with descendants whose ancestors were enslaved Indigenous people. This is a conversation between acclaimed Chiricahua Apache artist Bob Housis and his daughter, Native health researcher Emily Housis, about their ancestor, Juan de Dios. They discuss conflicting accounts of his identity.
There's so many different ways of interpreting who he was. There's the Spanish element or Hispanic element of our family that like to say that he was Hispanic. And there's other sides of the family that go from your grandma's talking that said he was always considered himself a Navajo, and that he was considered the Indian by the Hispanics. They didn't like him, but he went to the pueblos and performed in ceremonies and sang with them. Maybe just sang, but I'm not sure. I suppose he went down to the kivas and things. But so there are two different ways of looking at him, and I prefer to go from your grandma's opinion, even though the education she had really was separating her from her Indian roots, the Indian school, everything. And so she had a little bit of I think it's called racial self-hatred about her Indian side. And we all saw it and we lived with it because that was her experience. But she was never she never really talked about him until much, much later.
I think what I knew about him was that he was Navajo. Maybe he was kidnapped as a child and he was a slave. And then he grew up and married a Spanish woman. This is sort of the family history that I remember hearing. And then he guided maybe white settlers through New Mexico at some point, but he also spoke a bunch of native languages and participated. I mean, there was this whole sort of mythology around him. This is just kind of what I grew up hearing. And he was this, like almost a caricature of the best human ever in that era. But then in the last 20 years, I've started hearing more about him as a human, as a person, as a father, that have fleshed him out. But I still don't really know much more than that general framing. There are the people on Grandma's Hispanic side who disagree with a lot of what I just said, and they say, oh, you have to look in the books. There's books written about him. But even in the books, they don't talk much more than this sort of mythology of Juan de Dios. So what do you think of all this that I just told you?
Well, it's a strange thing. I've been told that if you're born in a Spanish village or even a ranch, the first thing they do is have you be baptized. He was never baptized. There's no baptismal record of him. And there is references to him as being the Indian. He always said he was taken from the Navajo Nation, which was a common practice of taking children and turning them into house workers and farm workers and ranchers, and also wives and mates and things. And the ranchers that adopted children treated them very well, as if they were own children. That was one of the positive things about the Spanish people is once you became a part of the community, you were treated well. But he said he was Navajo, and I have no reason to question that.
That was a taped interview with Chiricahua Apache father and daughter Bob and Emily Housis discussing the complex identity of Juan de Dios. Esteban, what does this account tell you, and how common do you hear stories like this?
Sean, I've been thinking about Juan de Dios for a very long time. In fact, I think we have located his baptismal record finally. He's certainly listed in census records all the way from 1900 to 1930. I remember the first time his daughter, Bob's mother, came to hear me talk about this. I remember her. This was when I was a resident scholar at SAR, the School for Advanced Research, in 1999. She walked up to me, put her hand on my chest, and said, "We're the same." I'll never forget it. And I had I was with the family when she was buried, Ana Maria, so I'll always remember her. But I got to know her And I got to know Juan de Dios through her. And those stories that were passed down to Bob and Emily are richer in many ways than with the documents. The documents are just fragments. Mm-hmm. And so to your question, Sean, that's precisely how we start excavating and recovering some of this material. It's almost all through fragments. And when we're fortunate to have a descendants like Bob and Emily and others that I've talked to, it enriches those documents. And even though there's all this tension about, well, who was he? How did he identify? How did the documents identify? The fact that Bob and Emily are here today speaks volumes about him being able to survive his captivity.
Yeah, it just never ceases to amaze me how much history that Native families have, and we're just walking around with it. We're not writing it down. It's in the mind there, in our memories, in our family history. Just absolutely fascinating. We have some more guests on the show, but first I want to take a caller. This is Lynn, who is listening in Wisconsin on station WOJB. Hello, Lynn. You're on the air.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I just had a quick question. It's fascinating how do you go about, because there are so many different, like linguistically.
Yeah, that's a good question, Lynn. Esteban, I noticed there are documents in Spanish, in English, in French, in some native languages as well. How do you navigate all those different languages?
It's a wonderful question. Thank you for calling in, Lynn. And of course, we've started to focus on those languages that Sean mentioned, but I think it was 2 years ago when we came across a book of burials from Mexico City, all in Otomí, an indigenous language. And so we didn't have at the time a linguist who was actually proficient in Otomí. And in fact, we've just opened up the conversation. We've not transcribed it. We've transcribed those records, but we've not translated it because we've not yet found someone who actually could be able to fully transcribe that in that way. But we also recognize that the way we want to do this is by working with communities who actually have that linguistic knowledge in order to actually decipher those records. And so we're going to do that record by record.
All right. Let's bring Teresa Pascual into the conversation now. She joins us from Acoma Pueblo. She is the Executive Vice President of Indigenous Affairs at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And Teresa, another one of these interviews in the archive occurs between you and Esteban. And in it, you describe the 1599 Battle of Acoma. And this is something that a lot of us Pueblo people have paid a lot of attention to over the centuries. After the battle, many of the Acoma survivors were enslaved. Help us better understand this event and the legacy of slavery by Spanish colonists in New Mexico Pueblo communities.
Thank you, Sean. I think here in New Mexico, many of us, especially among our Pueblo people, remember many of these events that have happened in our history. And although they occurred, and this battle that we are referring to here at Acoma occurred at 1599, really when we're talking about the span of time for us as Indigenous people, as Pueblo people, that memory really hasn't been all too long. And so it makes these kinds of stories, these kinds of narratives, our retelling of them or our recalling in our collective memory all the more present. So in late January of 1599, we have the Spanish conquistador Vicente Zaldivar, who comes to Acoma. Prior to January 1599, the Spanish had already been in the Southwest, had encountered numerous Pueblo communities at the time looking for looking for resources, looking for gold, looking for places to expand the lands of the Spanish crown. And in doing so, over time, the Spanish explorers really abused the welcome that the indigenous people, the native people, had given to them by taking more of their fair share of winter supplies, of game, of corn, turkeys. There are records and accounting of that there was a greed on their part. And in doing so, wore out their stay, wore out their welcome, and so the people of Acoma at the time would not tolerate this kind of abuse anymore. And so what ensues is a battle that was led by Conquistador Vicente Saldivar upon Acoma, in which the siege upon Acoma lasts for 3 days. And in that 3-day span, we see over 500 people killed at the pueblo. We also then see the capture of over 500 more Acoma people. Of those people that were captured, 300 of them were women and children. We have notes from that battle at that time by the Spanish that recount that 25 men, Acoma men, were taken as examples to quell and quash this any future uprising, were made examples of by having their foot severed as part of their punishment. We also have documents that note that both men and women were forced into servitude for 20 years. We show notes that have indications that young women between the ages of 12 on up, probably to about 25, were taken into slavery at that time as punishment, not only to the Acoma people for participating in this battle and the killing of Spanish soldiers at the time, but also as an example to other pueblos to say, do not resist Spanish rule. This is what will happen to you. Over time, we do see that in the historical record, it notes that many of those people that were forced into slavery were then parceled out into other areas to the government officials' residences, the Spanish officials' residences here in New Mexico, onto other missions as servants to the Franciscans. We see notes that indicate that women were forced into slavery and taken into Mexico City at the time to be enslaved as servants to convents and other missions within the interior of Mexico. So therein is part of the story, the trauma, the legacy that our people then carry throughout the 1600s as the mission of San Esteban Rey is built upon the Pueblo. We see the Pueblo Revolt, which occurs here in amongst the Pueblos in 1680, which is the culmination of resistance against Spanish rule at the time, and also a resistance to all of the abuses and atrocities that were occurring under the Spanish at the time. Here at Acoma Pueblo, after the Pueblo Revolt, we see recontrol of the mission there at Acoma in the late 1600s. But one part of the story that I know in my conversation with Esteban, that then brings us to the present is also this installation of the bells back into the mission of San Esteban del Rey after the Pueblo Revolt. That occurs in the late 1700s, early 1800s. The bells that were given are people noted at the time and still to this day the different tones of those bells and refer to them in a male-female way because of their differences in sound. And over time, our people have carried this burden from this traumatic time and this burden of loss, also of longing for those who were lost to our Acoma community, those who were killed during that time. But I think, as I noted to Esteban as part of that interview that we have done, that for myself it becomes personal because I think often of my family's children and grandchildren, and I think of them at the age of 12 and what it must have been like for Acoma families to have lost their loved ones into slavery at that time.
Right.
And how could a family carry that loss fully knowing that they would never see their children again? And so it becomes very real into the present day.
Teresa, thank you so much for just sharing all this knowledge and information on the show today. We're going to take a short break. We're going to come back and have some more questions for you. Listeners, stay with us. We'll be right back.
Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Strauss, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com.
Need help identifying community priorities? Kaufman & Associates' approach to evaluation is rooted in Indigenous knowledge, honoring tribal history, and sovereignty. More at kaufmaninc.com, KAUFFMANINC.com.
You're listening to Native America Calling. We will now continue our discussion on the new Native Bound, Unbound archive. And we have Philip Deloria on the show. He's another one of our guests, and we're going to bring him in momentarily. But first, I have one more question for Teresa Pascual. And Teresa, the history that you just shared, that was tough. That was just tough to listen to. And I know a lot of that history, but every time I hear it, and again, just to hear it from you and your knowledge, it's hard to listen to. The tragedy, the loss, you describe it as a burden of loss. And I just want to ask you quickly before we bring Philip in addition to being, of course, a citizen of Acoma Pueblo, you're also a resident of New Mexico. You are a New Mexican. And I'm curious to know, when you share these stories, this information to non-Native people in New Mexico and elsewhere, what's their reaction?
I think it opens eyes to understanding the past. Oftentimes, history books, what we know in the literature, is very narrow in scope, and so it leads to a fuller understanding, which is why Native Unbound, the project as a whole, is important, because it opens up doors and pathways to a fuller understanding of the past. And when we share that history, we can reflect, we can apply critical thinking, we can look at what we are dealing with in the present, and perhaps think broadly about how we approach both caring for those stories, but taking those threads of wisdom, strength, and resilience and applying them to our communities today and to present-day problem solving that comes as a result of that legacy.
All right. Teresa, thank you so much. Philip Deloria joins us now from Cambridge, Massachusetts. He is a professor of history at Harvard University. And Philip, you are not directly involved in this project, but you and Estevan have collaborated in the past. How would you describe the need for academic review of slavery involving Indigenous people?
Well, the need is great. And as Estevan mentioned earlier on, it's been very hard to sort of think about the ways that we can expand the narrative of Indigenous enslavement. When we talk about slavery, we think about white-collar plantations in the Southeast and African-American slavery. And to make this continental and hemispheric and global is just really important. I can list off 4 or 5 or 6 really good books, academic books on Indigenous enslavement that don't seem to have made any difference in terms of the way that we think about the narrative. And I'd say one other thing too, which is when we think about African-American enslavement, we have an online data source. It's called Slave Voyages, which is absolutely fantastic. And what Native Bound Unbound does is to put the story of Indigenous enslavement into that same space and make it available in a very high quality research, kind of online environment for anybody, as Estevan mentioned, artists, historians, local folks, tribal narrators. I mean, it really sort of opens up a new chapter, I think, for us in such an amazing way. And it's incredibly painful, but it's also kind of amazing to see it.
Mm-hmm. Philip, with a project like this, so much of what is available comes from European colonists, right, who used written language in documentation, formal records. With regard to the oral history and some of these other elements we're learning about today, how do historians get a better sense of Indigenous perspective so many centuries later?
I think it's the question that we all confront, and some part of it is sort of how we read the colonial archive, and we talk about it a lot. I'll read it between the lines. I'll brush against the grain. I'll read it with a sideways glance. So we have lots of sort of ways of thinking about reading those colonial archives for the nature of Indigenous voice. I'll just give you a quick example. My colleague Dan Carpenter has an amazing database of petitions. He's a political scientist interested in petitions, and he went through and sort of, found every petition ever submitted to Congress up until, I think, 1949. Well, who's doing all that petitioning? It turns out Native people. And what do the petitions look like? Native voice, right? People actually saying what they want, putting their names on something. So it's possible to find in the colonial archive many, many, many traces of Native peoples. And this is partly, I think, what Native Bound Unbound is able to do. But the flip side of that is, as Teresa said, and Native families, and you said actually, and we all just sort of know, as Teresa said, was a great example of, there are so many stories that are still extant in families, and sometimes they're hazier memories than others, and sometimes they're clues, and sometimes they're fully recalled narratives. And, so anytime you're working with the colonial archive, you also have to think about the ways that, an Indigenous oral archive might be part of what you're doing. And I would add to that an Indigenous written archive as well.
Philip, we've touched on already some brief comparisons to what Indigenous North American slavery looked like compared to Africanist slavery, but can you give us some more details? What are the key differences between the two?
Well, Native North American enslavement oftentimes tends to prioritize women and children. There's a lot of domestic labor. Which means Estevan and his team have a very hard task because women and children oftentimes disappear more easily from the archives. The original Spanish sort of the new laws, what were called the new laws, made slavery illegal. As Andres Ursendes argued, a few years back in a very strong, amazing book called The Other Slavery, that meant that things that were coming out of the Spanish context were illegal, which didn't mean they weren't happening. But it did mean that some of the records went sort of off the books, So there are those kinds of challenges and things to think about. It's also worth thinking about the ways that, Native people had systems of unfreedom on this continent before any European arrived. And Europeans had systems of unfreedom that they brought with them. But there's also these hybrid systems that emerge in the context of colonialism and the context of Atlantic African slavery. So, for example, the sort of trading out kind of slavery that oftentimes happens along the Atlantic, where Native people will be taken prisoner and enslaved and then swapped out for African bodies that are coming from the Caribbean. The idea being that Native folks in the Caribbean have no way of escaping. So there's those kinds of things. There's the colonial wars. I'm sitting here in New England where we think a lot about the Pequot War, about King Philip's War, Queen Anne's War, 7 Years' War. In all of these wars, they're colonial wars in the sense that they're seizing native land, but they're taking native prisoners and enslaving them, and oftentimes sending them down to the Caribbean. Or we can think about the French systems that were sort of using tribes, across the Great Lakes and into the Northern Plains to seize other native people, routing them through trade networks down the St. Lawrence and off to the Caribbean. Or the native Southeast, where, the English would arm one group and send them out as slave raiders to capture another group. So there's so many different things that are happening in this continental and hemispheric version of the story.
And the system that was in place, the economic system and related factors, I mean, they just had all the boxes checked in terms of how to make this work. Startling to hear you describe it like that, Philip. Let's bring this up into more of a contemporary context now, because you've written a lot in your career about Native identity. And we know of instances in this country in which the identity picture is muddied because enslaved people often don't have the benefit of documentation. But is there a better way now to incorporate that reality into contemporary views of Native identity, do you think?
That's a good question. Yes. And I think we've seen this as we've watched, the five tribes sort of deal with their own histories of unfreedom and thinking about the very, very difficult kinds of identity issues there. And we can map some of those same issues, I think, into some of the larger contexts. Certainly, New England tribes have established really interesting relations with folks in the Caribbean and Bermuda and places like that, all of which feed back into the ways in which we think about, identities in particular places, but also identities that are very, very mobile over time, and the ways that the categories of race are really become quite complicated. There's a moment where Native slaves are described as Spanish slaves, and that means that they are indigenous, but they quickly disappear into blackness, right? In the Atlantic slave system, black equals slave equals black, indigenous slaves comes to equal black relatively quickly. And so we lose track of some of those things relatively, relatively soon in those kinds of systems.
I want to touch back on the whole concept of oral history, and we both commented on how so many of our families, we have this information, we have this knowledge that we share amongst ourselves, but there's always a challenge with certain parts of academia that don't want to acknowledge oral history, or they discount it. They don't think it is as legitimate or as authentic academically as what's written down, what is documented officially. It seems like a constant tug of war for folks like you, Philip, and Teresa also, and Esteban. How do you balance that, and how do you get the proper recognition and respect that oral history might deserve?
Is that open to all of us, Sean?
I was going to ask Philip first. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Esteban, you want to go?
Yeah, feel free, Esteban. It sounds like you got a lot to say here.
Well, I love the question, Sean, because what we're trying to do is actually say a blanket is probably even more meaningful to how we think about the memory and the history of enslavement than a document that brings all this ethnocentrism and bias into it. We recognize that. And certainly the same could be said of an oral history. We know that memory shifts from generation to generation, but it carries power in it. That trauma that Teresa was speaking about, that is passed down in communities, and it's passed down in families. And so we are trying to figure out a way in this project to actually place all of that into conversation. whether it's a weaving, whether it's an art, a representation in art, or a document. We want to place them into conversation, recognizing that there's that tension in terms of how scholarship has treated that, the hierarchy of that. But we recognize that all of these are imprints that are left from the past into the future, into the present.
Thank you, Esteban. Philip, feel free to chime in here.
I mean, I think Esteban has said it really, really well. I mean, for me, kind of working in, as you were saying, the sort of the academic context of a department and a university, we do, this is better than it used to be. There's a much greater acceptance of oral history and oral tradition, but it's also the case that, triangulating oftentimes is, the kind of road to, I don't want to say you have to triangulate every time to achieve legitimacy. I think, we have to always make the argument for the legitimacy of oral traditions. But it's also, we're historians and we like to find multiple sources for all kinds of things. And it is one of the great joys, actually, to find certain things that show up in an oral archive to be confirmed in another kind of form. And whether that's a blanket, as Esteban is talking about, or whether it's a written document, or whether it's a piece of other material culture, So we're always looking for ways to build the richest kind of story that we can build, and I think that's also one of the things that is happening on this, on this site.
Teresa, what are your thoughts with regard to the legacy of oral history and in your own family? And I'm curious, how do you maintain it? How do you foster it? How do you pass it on from one generation to the next?
Yes, Sean. I think there is. This is why in tribal communities, the retention and passing on of our traditional languages is so important, because our traditional languages really are the key to understanding the past. They unlock those long told narratives that our elders have kept for many generations. And although sometimes in academia those narratives are often overlooked or dismissed, we are now seeing a point in research where we see a lot of those narratives being confirmed by the presence of tangible information that correlates to those narratives. And so I don't think at this point we are at a point where we can dismiss those kinds of narratives. And so retelling them, holding them within our communities is all the more important, especially when communities are facing the loss of our traditional languages.
Teresa, I was at a conference a while back, and there was some discussion about oral history, and there was a person, there's kind of this thought that, we need to capture this oral history. We need to write it down. We need to make videos. We need to make recordings. And there was this one person, and he stood up, he said, the problem with that is when you take these stories and you take this history that was always meant to be transmitted orally, you change it. You change it when you do that, when you document it. We got about 30 seconds before we have to wrap up. I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, there is some loss when we write those stories down. There is another intangible context that comes with those stories that is held within families and clans and medicine societies that is just as powerful as the written record. And so that is why this project, Native Bound Unbound, is important, because it takes the time to help us understand that context.
All right. Thank you. Esteban, I'm going to give you the last word. Again, we've got maybe about 20 seconds, but you've got an event coming up in Abiquiu. Give us a brief overview.
Sean, I can't thank you enough. And I invite your listening public to actually join us, contribute to this in any way. It's about a process that we're engaged in. This Saturday in Abiquiu, we are holding what I often refer to as a memory workshop. We're gathering surrounding communities to come and share stories, to listen to stories. And that's going to be in Abiquiu, November 8th at 2 p.m. Please join us. Thank you so much.
All right. And I want to thank our guests who joined the show today, Esteban Raul Galvez, Philip Deloria, and Teresa Pascual. Please, I invite you listeners to join us again tomorrow. We'll have a look at the first formal treaty between Australia and its Aboriginal people. It was just signed in the state of Victoria. I'm Sean Spruce. You've been listening to the one, the only, Native America Calling.
The Association on American Indian Affairs invites all to Tribal Museums Day, December 6th through December 12th. Tribal museums may offer no-cost or reduced admission, gift shop discounts, art markets, and live cultural demonstrations. Tribal Museums Day honors diverse Native nations as the experts of their own cultures. You can find a map of tribal museums and more at indian-affairs.org/Tribal Museums Day. The association supports this show.
Skugtash oigamo uchuchuga ko toipia kutoaki. Owuminyo kokojamaki makai kosmaimo asmasma uchuchuga kuipi mumkita. Cancer, Chastio Asapu Muhuja, Ambites Maki Monuik Healthcare.gov/coverage. Omahaguga the Kumako Gigi, Sikort, Y Kumako Gigi, Gog Hutas Pumuk Ju, Ida Amjet Himaka Medicare to Medicaid Hajipka.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.